Douglas Reed continues. When the general persecution began, I report it as I saw it. If I learned of a concentration camp containing 1,000 captives, I reported this. If I learned that the 1,000 included 30 or 50 Jews, I reported that. I saw the first terror, spoke with many of the victims, examined their injuries, and was warned that I incurred Gestapo hostility thereby. The victims were in the great majority, certainly much over 90%, Germans, and a few were Jews. This reflected the population ratio in Germany and later in the countries overrun by Hitler. But the manner of reporting in the world's press, in time, blocked out the great suffering mass, leaving only the case of the Jews. Similarly, when the Soviet troops who, it will be remembered, also invaded Poland prior to the beginning of the war, finally overran Poland and Eastern Germany towards the end of the war. It was they who took over most of the concentration camps, and just as Hitler had used them to dispose of his political enemies, used them to dispose of Stalin's political enemies, many of whom had been prevented from escaping across the River Elbe by the armies of the Western Allies, an awful scenario, of which the general public were never informed. As Douglas Reed again points out, the Western masses knew nothing of these happenings in British-American-occupied Germany at the time, and might not have objected violently if they had known. For at that period, they were still under the influence of wartime propaganda, particularly in the matter of the Nazi concentration camps. They seem to me completely to have forgotten that the concentration camp was originally a communist idea, copied by Hitler, and that the further the Red Armies were allowed into Europe, the more certain its perpetuation became. Their feelings were infamed by the horrifying newsreel pictures shown to them on 1,000,000 screens as the Allied armies entered Germany, of piles of emaciated corpses stacked like firewood in these camps. I was a member of those audiences and heard the comments around me with misgiving. Wartime propaganda is the most insidious poison known to man. And I believe cheese picturegoers of 1945, deprived of truthful information for years, had lost all ability, perhaps all desire, to judge what they saw. I think most of them thought the human remains they saw were those of Jews. For this was re-suggestion hammered into their minds by the press day by day. They can standy read of Nazi gas chambers for Jews, Nazi crematoria for Jews, and few of them in later years troubled to read the stories of inmates and find out who these victims truly were. One instance, a German woman who spent 5 years in Ravensbrück camp, Frau Margaret Bubers, Newman, says the first victims were the sick or afflicted, or those incapable of work, and the next ones were the inferior races, among whom the Poles were placed first, and the Czechs, Balts, Hungarians, and others next. Thus, the piles of dead received as little true compassion as the living, who were driven back by the Western Allies into the concentration camp area. And today, it may be only a matter of historical interest, pertaining to such a book as this, to show that the Nazi concentration camps, at the time when the Anglo-American armies entered Germany, were predominantly under communist control, that Jews were among the tormentors, and that anti-communism was a surer qualification for the death chamber than and Hitlerism. Douglas Reed concludes, communists ran these camps, tortured and murdered the victims. If there was any difference between them and the Gestapo jailers, it was only that they were more villainous, because they denounced and killed men who were supposed to be their comrades in battle against a common foe. As the Eastern Jews, in particular, play so large a part in communism, Jews logically appear among the persons implicated in these deeds. That is not in itself surprising at all, for Jews, like all other men, are good and bad, cruel or humane. But it was kept hidden from the public masses, who received a picture of torture camps inhabited almost entirely by Jews, tormented by depraved Nazi captors. The Jews formed a small proportion of the entire camp population. The tormentors in the last 3 years of the war were largely communists, whose motives have been shown, and among these tormentors were Jews. The media campaign directed against Hitler, designed to persuade the people of the West and of the East that there was no truth whatsoever in Hitler's statements about the activities of the Freemasons, and that all the courses of action which he had initiated in order to bring his allegedly madly imagined state of affairs to an end were crimes which ought to be punished, culminated in the notorious Nuremberg trials, one of history's most carefully contrived judicial pantomimes. Naturally, the media coverage portrayed these trials as one of the major landmarks in history of human rights and impartial due legal process. The view was expressed that the accused were fortunate even to get a trial, let alone a fair one, since any less impartial victors might well have summarily executed them on the spot in angry revenge. This media cover-up picture of the Nuremberg trials continues to be sustained today, as it has been since the trials first took place. It needs but a brief glance at the record of these trials to discover that their outcome had been virtually decided before they began, and that they were designed to inflict as much torment on the accused as possible, before they were finally disposed of by being hanged on the Jewish Day of Judgment, Hoshana Rabbah. The records of the Nuremberg trials, for those who care to go beyond the trite media picture of dastardly criminals being brought to justice by the just, provide a clear example of the extent to which the Kafir legal and Kafir medical systems can be employed to eliminate opposition. Unlike Ezra Pound, whose political opinions had received hardly any publicity or coverage in the media system, the German propaganda machine had aired Hitler's views to such an extent that it was impossible to pretend that they did not exist. Whereas Pound's views had been contained by keeping him silenced, Hitler's views had to be rendered ineffective and made to look ridiculous by distorting them through exaggeration, thereby discrediting them. This could only be achieved by presenting Haider and his immediate followers as violent and inhuman psychopaths who, blinded by ignorance and racist hatred, had somehow mesmerized and terrorized the German people, not only into attempting to eliminate all the Jews in Europe, but also into fighting a war which they did not really wish to fight. In order to achieve that object, one of the means by which this impression was created was the Nuremberg trials, laying the name of international law, which is otherwise known as the law of international expediency and of justice. Their words and actions were accordingly manipulated and arranged so as to create the desired picture, which was then spread abroad by the Freemasonic-controlled media system. It was imperative that the accused should be found fit to stand trial, even though they were subsequently to be presented to the world as mentally deranged beings, who could hardly be described as humans. Clearly, if any of them could successfully plead that they were unfit for trial, then the impact and force of the picture which was to be presented to the public would thereby be diminished. Accordingly, the appropriate medical experts were selected to adjudge the accused as being normal enough to stand trial, and it comes as no surprise to learn that this was the conclusion to which they all came. The only way to avoid standing trial was by committing suicide, a course of action which only a very limited number of the accused chose to adopt. As in the case of Ezra Pound, the accused were kept in solitary confinement and in unsavoury conditions, albeit not out in the open, in order to soften them up for the impending judicial proceedings. It was during this period of solitary confinement, which lasted several months, that the accused were subjected to the famous Rorschach tests, the results and interpretations of which were subsequently used to great effect in the post-trial propaganda campaign against the followers of Hitler. The Rorschach tests were initially begun by an English psychiatrist, who some years later was to commit suicide on New Year's Eve by swallowing one of the cyanide capsules which had been found on Goering after his own suicide. Allah says in the Quran that the one who does not follow the way of the prophets is self-destroyed. This psychiatrist was not considered ideally suited for the leading psychiatrist role in the Nuremberg stage production, and was accordingly replaced by a more expert American expert early on in the show. It was this man who conducted the Rorschach tests on the accused, and subsequently wrote volumes on his so-called expert findings. The basis of the Rorschach tests is to present the patient with a series of large symmetrical ink blots, each differing in shape and color. The patient gives a verbal reaction to each blot as it is shown, stating what he or she sees in it. The medical expert then interprets the patient's reactions on the basis that what the patient has seen in the blot is in fact a reflection of the patient's own reality. It comes as no surprise to learn that the reactions of the accused to the Rorschach tests were interpreted so as to give medically tested credibility to the popular image which was being created of the Nazis being depicted as dangerous, psychopathic subhuman beasts. The underlying assumption behind these tests, that is, that the Rorschach tests are a valid means of measuring what is normal and abnormal and what is sane and insane, is a fallacious one. Not only because, as we have already seen, kafir conceptions of what is normal and what is sane are not connected to the true nature of existence, but in fact, cover it up, but also because the methodology used is itself faulty. What the Rorschach method fails to make adequate provision for is the psychological makeup of the medical expert who carries out the tests. Since there is some truth in the assumption that the patient does see his or her own reflection in what is in front of him or her, it follows that this is also true for the medical expert, and that therefore the medical expert's reactions to the responses of the patient to the Rorschach test provide in themselves a further secondary Rorschach-type response, so that any evaluation of the patient's response by the medical expert is in reality an evaluation by the expert of his or her own self. In other words, the medical expert's interpretation of the Nuremberg accused responses was in itself a reflection of the expert's own inner reality, just as much as the accused's reaction to the blots was initially a reflection of the accused's own inner reality. The conclusion which the medical experts reached regarding the accused, in fact, applied to themselves, just as the opinions which the medical experts had reached as regards Ezra Pound's sanity were in fact descriptions of the state of their own sanity. This is one aspect of the underlying unity of existence, of which the kafir expert is often unaware, that the patients whom a doctor has tend to reflect his or her reality, just as the people who come before a judge tend to reflect his or her reality. This is partly why different doctors have different kinds of patients, and different judges have different types of cases. As far as the Nuremberg trials are concerned, there was no difference between the accusers and the accused, and no difference between the judges and the judged, and, what is more, and contrary to established legal practice, the accusers and the judges were in reality one and the same. The idea that the kafir expert is somehow a detached observer of life is one of the hallmarks of the kafir view of existence. He or she thinks that because of his or her special knowledge, or rather superior ability in amassing and juggling with information, he or she is capable of forming a detached and objective view of reality in which he or she is neither directly, not indirectly implicated. The truth is that there is no split in existence. There is only one reality. No one is separate from the rest of existence, even if they imagine that to be the case. The truth is that everyone in creation only sees what is in their own heart. Whatever is in your heart appears before you in creation. Whatever you see in creation is a reflection of yourself. All you ever get back from the world is the echo of your own voice. It follows that the only real doctors are the Awliya of Allah, that is, the friends of Allah, who have been given the idhn, that is, the authority, to cure the hidden illnesses of the heart and the self, by Allah, and to lead people from ignorance to knowledge and gnosis of Allah, by Allah. The Awliya of Allah who teach with idhn are the only doctors in the world who see things as they are, which is to say, as they are not, with a direct seeing. The kafir medical expert gives reality to what he imagines to be real, but which in fact is illusory. The Awliya of Allah give reality to the real, Allah. It follows that the Awliya who teach with idhn cannot lie. Whoever comes into their presence receives a true reflection of his or her own self, and at the same time benefits from, and is transformed by the light of Allah, which is their light. Since all this happens by Allah, and since the Awliya know this, they are unable to charge money for what they do. This is the sign of the rightly guided man of Allah, that he is rightly guided by Allah, and that he does not ask for money, the complete antithesis of the kafir medical expert. For the same reasons, the Awliya of Allah are the people who are best equipped to judge between people, when a judge is needed, because their firqan, that is, their ability to discriminate between what is just and what is unjust, is guided by the Quran and by the Hadith, and is by Allah. Since they are the ones who have the most knowledge of Allah, it follows that they have most knowledge awful that comes from Allah, and are therefore in the best position to decide matters.